crying.
We can harvest that sunlight, we can create useful high energy products. Now, one of those products is biomass. I'm largely going to talk about plants, but maybe now and then touch on algae. I'm not really an algal person, I'm more of a plant person, but the same principles apply, so I'll kind of jump between the two. And this is a perfect example of biomass. These guys here are biomass. They're not much use to us. You could put them in a hamburger, and maybe real soon now you'll discover that they are in hamburgers. But the real interesting biomass for us is the plant. Now this is a really nice plant, and hopefully no one is going to cut this down and do something biomass-like with it, because it's a beautiful sequoia, and that's why these guys are climbing it. But it's a perfect example. Biomass is all around us. It's also energy rich. This is Australia. A good place to go if you want to do a barbecue. Australia burns frequently because of the energy rich vegetation that's there. Vegetation is energy rich. In Australia, they set fire to it, and you get these beautiful pictures of burning vegetation. The message here is biomass contains lots of energy. We can burn it. We can do useful things with biomass in respect of energy. Now, all of this biomass begins with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the factory for biomass. And so with photosynthesis, we have some way of converting sunlight into useful organic products. Key thing here is carbon dioxide. Along with light, photons, this is the input to photosynthesis. And also carbon dioxide at the moment is a particular problem, or we perceive it to be a particular problem because of the greenhouse effect. I'll come back to that in a little bit, but carbon dioxide plays a pretty big role in the story of using plants and photosynthesis to do useful things with sunlight to make biomass. And of course, now we get to the difficult areas. It also brings us to agriculture and land use. How do you like to see the countryside? Do you see it like this? Ye olde England, every little sheep loved and cherished with a name. Or do you see it like this? A big factory to make stuff that you eat or wear or burn. This makes a big difference to how you think about how we use biomass. If you have the romantic view, or the really I couldn't care less view, as long as it tastes good, well actually these sheep would probably taste beautiful, maybe even the dog, who knows, in a hamburger, what can I say, it's an old joke. So anyway, agriculture is a question here, land use, and one of the questions is food. What about food? What about the competition between biomass, which is basically just stuff, just green stuff, and food, which is what we eat? How do you see food? Again, you know, is it vegetables? Are you vegetarian? Or do you like it to, well, make a noise when you eat it? Do you imagine that it's grown like this? How do you see the competition between land use for food and land use for biomass? And how do you see the future of agriculture in relation to productivity, and particularly things like GMOs? Because we all have issues with GMOs. You take a fine specimen of Irish manhood, so my mother says, like this. GMO, what's going to do? Well, is it like this? Or does it work like this? I mean, I prefer this. But some people, for GM, this is their vision of it. And of course, if you're thinking, yes, I've got a supporter here. He thinks I should look like this. Some of my students think I do look like this. But, okay, we do have a problem. If you want to do a lot of interesting things with crop productivity, with biomass, you have to think, what about the risks associated with genetic modification? Do they exist at all? Or are they exaggerated? Or is this the worst thing ever? Are we doomed because of it? So what about photosynthesis? Back to business. This is the kind of textbook portrayal of photosynthesis. This top line. So I just pick up a laser pointer. Have I brought it? Yeah. Cheap, boring red one. So this is the textbook portrayal of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide plus water, you add light, magic stuff happens, and you get carbohydrate, normally shown as glucose, though photosynthesis does not make glucose. But it's always shown like this, so I'm not going to break the sort of textbook model, and oxygen. It really is a magic mechanism. Wonderful stuff. You can study it, and you can play with it. You can do a lot with it. And it's very diverse, and it is a relatively efficient process in many respects. It has some weaknesses, and the weaknesses are the things that we really address in the Biosolar program. We want to understand the weaknesses, and we want to try and fix those weaknesses. So it's not perfect, but it still does a pretty good job a lot of the time. So basically it takes a low energy molecule, carbon dioxide, forgive the simplified thermodynamics, high energy photons from our dear beloved sun, and converts it to a high energy organic substance. Basically produces sugars, just not glucose. Produces sugar phosphates and then sucrose, which is what you see here. High energy organic chemicals. So we take something which we really can do very little with, relatively low energy molecule, add some energy, all sorts of magic stuff happens inside leaves and algae, and you end up with high energy organic chemicals. Now, we can do lots with those high energy organic chemicals, but nature, you know, this is an evolved process, and it fulfills roles in nature. It basically drives it's the energy input to ecosystems like this. You know, forests, savannas, everything you see here is basically the consequence of photosynthesis. We exploit it for agriculture. Crop productivity is driven by photosynthesis. Everything you eat is basically derived from photosynthesis. Whether you're a vegetarian or carnivore, you're eating photosynthesis. This leads ultimately for all of the energy and nutrients needed for life on Earth, or nearly all the life on Earth, and even some intelligent life, like our little bird friend here. You're sitting wondering, why is that guy taking a picture of moi? But if you want a crazy picture, find a bird. They do look somehow strange, but so it's a big program. It's a very, very big process. Gross terrestrial primary productivity, which basically means photosynthesis, is about 123 gigatons of carbon per year. A gigaton is a billion. So that's 123 gigatons of carbon is fixed by photosynthesis every year. On land, I don't have a number for marine systems, of which the net primary production, in other words, that's what's left after the plants have done their thing. They've grown, made new leaves, made roots, all of this, you know, spent energy. About 105 billion tons of carbon is available in marine and terrestrial systems as food for animals, bacteria, fungi, etc. And of which about 56.5 is terrestrial, 48.5 is marine. So it's a big global process. It's visible from space. All of this green is photosynthesis on land. You don't see the Great Wall of China from space. You see forests, grasslands. It's mega. You're talking about a process that changes this planet. The oxygen in our atmosphere comes from photosynthesis. The chemistry of our biosphere is driven by photosynthesis. The geology of the surface of the Earth depends on photosynthesis. The reason we have iron oxide in large quantities in places like Australia, North America, South Africa, which we mine, all of that is oxidized iron produced as a result of photosynthetic oxygen production way back in the Precambrian period. I can't remember exactly, Phanerozoic. Anyway, all of that is to do with photosynthesis. So photosynthesis has geological impacts. And it's important not only on land, but also in sea. This is an algal bloom off the coast of Ireland. Again, visible from space. This is photosynthesis in action. So it is truly a big process. It is one of the most, it is probably the most significant biological process on this planet, except possibly for our own biological process. But the motivation for our interest in photosynthesis in the biosolar program is this kind of stuff, which you've seen before, I'm sure. This is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this shows the history of carbon dioxide and the history of average global temperatures measured here in the Vostok ice core. So basically drilling down into the Antarctic ice sheet, getting the bubbles that are in the ice and analysing them and using the composition of the gas in those bubbles to give us some idea about what the climate was like over the last 500,000 years, and the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Dust you can forget about. Look at CO2 and look at temperature. As the CO2 levels go up and down, so does temperature. So at the moment, of course, we're at 0, because we're looking here at temperature differences, and you can see over the last 500,000 years, the temperatures have been largely lower than today, and CO2 concentrations have been lower. Whenever the CO2 concentrations are higher, the temperature is higher. So that leads a lot of people to strongly believe that CO2 levels in the atmosphere drive temperature changes on the planet. At the moment, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is going up very strongly. From about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, 1769, was the steam engine James Watt, you can start to see after that point CO2 levels start to rise as a result of modern industrialization. So we're now up at about 400 ppm, which means the atmospheric CO2 goes up, which means we can expect temperature increases. And that, for a lot of people, is a reason to be concerned. Now, speaking personally, I'm from Ireland, and a little bit of global warming would mean in Ireland we'd have a decent climate for the first time in about 10 million years. And I think that's not too bad. However, for a lot of other people, a little bit of global warming represents chaos and catastrophe for the biosphere. And it's not that high CO2 levels are a problem. At the moment, we have a relatively low CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and temperatures are relatively low. We're at the moment in an ice age, geologically speaking. 85% of the history of the Earth, we've had a greenhouse world. At the moment, we've got an ice age world. So 85% of the time, CO2 levels have been higher, often much higher. So having high CO2 and higher average temperatures isn't exactly unusual. It's not good. So there's every incentive to try and control this rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, because while it will take us to perhaps a more normal condition for this planet, the journey will be a hellish one. So for Europe, we have to cut our CO2 emissions by about 90%. There's about an 80% cut globally. But if we've got to have the same share of CO2 emissions, Europe has to cut its CO2 emissions by about 90%. Do we get our fair share of CO2 emissions? Now this shows the history of energy consumption from 1820 to, 2000s here. So we're talking 2020, this must be an extrapolation. Biofuels are right down here. Coal, oil, natural gas, a little bit of nuclear, and a little bit of hydro. Now, 90% cut for Europe really takes us down to kind of round about here. We can have a little bit of CO2 emission, not much, because biofuels, coal, oil and natural gas, those are all CO2 producing sources of energy. But we're right down here. So basically in the past, we're almost going back to the good old days where we would have got energy from biofuels. This is a global analysis, and a lot of people in the world, of course, are still getting energy from biofuels. So it requires really Europe to cut substantially all its CO2 emitting sources of energy, or to do something which recaptures that carbon dioxide, which is, of course, is an option. You can produce the carbon dioxide and then capture it and stick it under the North Sea, for example. Why not? It's a possibility. However, whatever we do, if we're going to control CO2 emissions, we need to radically change the way we produce energy, the way we think about energy. And it's expected, I guess, there's going to be a major change in energy sources. There may be more nuclear. A lot of people don't like nuclear, but it is an option. And more renewables, of course. That's pretty popular with a lot of people because it sounds very good. But it brings with it all sorts of problems. Using renewables isn't always going to be as easy as some people will tell you, because there's a lot of technology to be developed and there's a lot of solutions that have to be found. But renewables would include wind, various kinds of solar, tidal, wave, and of course there's also biofuels. Biofuels, okay, we've been using them for a long time, and a lot of people still use them, but they also bring with them problems. So there's no easy solution here. Whatever we do, it's probably going to require a bit of difficult choices to be made, and probably some sacrifices to be made. Whether it's as bad as going to the dentist, I'm not sure. But somewhere on the scale of things not being perfect, we're on there. Something bad has to happen for someone. Something they probably don't like, something that's a little bit uncomfortable. Every time I listen to BBC News in the morning, when they mention there's going to be another wind farm somewhere, there's always someone complaining about the wind farm. If you're talking about tidal power, that has come up so many times with regard to the energy supply in the UK, I've almost forgotten, because there's always someone complains about where they want to put the tidal barrier. All of these things bring with them problems. If they hadn't brought problems, if they were easy to use, if they were cheap, and if no one minded, we would be using all of these already. The fact that we're using coal, oil, natural gas, etc. is because they're cheap and they're relatively painless. Nobody minds when you have a gas-fired power station a few hundred meters away. They get really upset if you want to build a nuclear power station. They get really upset if you want to build a wind turbine anywhere near their nice little house in the country. So, we will have problems. But let's say at least one option, and it is simply an option, is that we might be able to use plants and algae as not only a source of energy, but of energy-rich organic raw materials. Raw materials that you can use to drive an aircraft across the Atlantic, so you can go and visit your uncle or your aunt in Seattle. Energy that you can put in an aircraft to fly on your holiday. Raw materials that you can use to make plastics, to make clothes, to make all of the stuff that we use. Plants and algae, between them, have the capacity to make lots of raw materials. Raw materials that are a source of energy. Oops. Looks like it didn't crash. Raw materials for energy, raw materials for industrial purposes. The question is, can we make it fit in with other demands? The problems with plants with regards to using them as sources of energy and raw materials is firstly, of course, the food versus fuel debate. Is it morally acceptable to use plants or land area as a source of basically an industrial product. I think the question here is not an easy one to answer, and I think it opens up a much bigger debate, in my opinion, about how we use land. I mean, is it more immoral to use a hectare of land to grow a crop for a bioenergy purpose than it is to take a hectare of land and turn it into a golf course? Which of those is the worst? Is it bad for the Americans to convert maize into ethanol rather than selling that maize to a European cattle farmer so he can feed it to his cows to produce cheap beef for Europeans? That maize isn't going to feed poor Africans, it's going to feed rich Europeans more meat so we can get even fatter. I mean, in many European countries, obesity is now a serious problem. So, you know, if you want to discuss the food versus fuel debate, I think you need to open it up to a bigger question about how we use land. Another question is, I mean, should someone in Europe be denied the right to use land area to grow biomass crop, to produce bioethanol, to put into someone's car so they can drive to work every morning? Because agriculture in some developing countries is completely inefficient, and we're not really doing anything to improve their agricultural productivity so they can manage with their own land area to grow enough food to keep them satisfied. So we need to supply them food because their agriculture is underpowered. All of these, I think, are very difficult questions, and they're all tied up with this food versus fuel question and land use. The next thing is a lot of the things that we want to do, or we might want to do, or we might need to do, whether it's improving food production or whether it's improving the productivity of plants for biomass purposes to use them for industrial processes, brings us into the question of genetic modification. What's our take on this? How serious are our reservations about the GM question? The other problem, which is a physiological problem, which is where I come in principally, is the low efficiency of plants. Good biomass crops at the moment manage about 1 to 2% on an annual average. Now, this is considerably greater than you would get for an agricultural food crop plant. But this shouldn't come as a surprise, because when we grow plants for food, we grow them to produce things that we eat. And that adds special complications to the breeding and production process. When you're growing them for biomass, you just want lots of stuff. And then you tend to go for different plants. And those high productivity plants normally are about 1 to 2% on an annual average in places like the United States. In Northern Europe, you wouldn't make this number, for reasons I'll come back to in a little while, but it's a fairly obvious reason once you get to it. However, these plants, so they manage 1 to 2% on an annual average, can manage maybe 4.5 to 5% at a sustained maximum rate. Sustained means several weeks. So they can be very productive, it's just that most of the time. If you average it out over the year, they're not. And one of the things we can fix is this. We can fix some of these problems using physiology and genetics. Big advantages of plants is they're very low tech. Basically, what do? You go out, you get a piece of land, you dig a hole, you put your plant in, you walk away, it rains, the plant grows, you come back and you harvest it. It's very simple industry. Algae can be probably more productive, but they will often be grown in quite high-tech systems. Now, the question is which of these will work out to be the most economic, and the most economic for which purposes. There's going to be a very interesting set of economic and industrial developments around algae in the future. And I'm not sure where the algae thing ends up, because we're really developing algae now for the first time. And there's a lot of unknowns as to how that technology will actually develop and how it will prove itself in terms of economically viable industry. But it will give us lots of nice stuff. And pure bioenergy crops also don't need good land. You wouldn't grow a bioenergy crop on a polder, for example. That's where you grow food crops, because you need good quality land for food crops, but bioenergy crops can grow on very poor quality land because we don't care about the protein content of these things. And when you're talking about food crops, you're normally talking about protein. Grass for cattle to make milk has to be rich in protein. Grass for cattle to make beef has to be rich in protein, because the cattle have got to get the protein from somewhere. If you want to grow wheat or any other staple food, you need protein. It's not just carbohydrate. So for that you need good soil with fertilizer. When you're growing bioenergy crops, you're normally just talking about carbohydrate, no nitrogen. So you can grow these in a much more nutrient efficient way on low quality land. So that partly solves the problem about food versus fuel if you can grow bioenergy crops on land that you can't really use very much for anything else. The other possibility, of course, is to combine bioenergy with food production. Can you use the waste and material from food crops as an input into a bioenergy system? Could you breed food crops so that they will be more dual use? At the moment, our wheat plants are only about this big. They used to be this big. Of course, they made them small to stop them from falling over. And then the easy way to do that, well, make them smaller. They don't fall over so easily. Of course, if you made them bigger and stronger, then maybe you could use this little bit up here as food and all of the rest of it as a bioenergy input. It's a possibility. I mean, there are lots of possibilities that you can think about, but need to be really thought through in detail. Okay, plants, of course, are food. Like I said, possibly we can combine plants as food and plants as energy sources. Now, algae are less controversial when it comes to this food, fuel and debate. But remember, algae are also conceivably edible. They're not edible by us. If we eat algae, we get what's politely known as the low molecular weight solute syndrome, which means diarrhea. So that's what I call it, something, because we can't really digest algae. But cattle, etc. can. And whether algae will be used more for food purposes and less for energy purposes, I'm not sure. I can think of lots of ways that we could use algae that would produce useful foodstuffs for things like cattle, chickens, pigs, etc. Of course, my colleagues who work on the biosolar program are very committed to the use of algae as a source of energy-rich molecules for fuel. They're very dedicated on that research line, but I can imagine other people will think of algae as sources of other products which are also useful, not as, perhaps as food and food-type products. But overall, whatever we're going to do with algae and plants, we will need, if we're going to use them for food and energy, we will need to improve the usefulness and productivity of plants and algae to allow them to be used as a source of energy and raw materials and food. And increasingly, that's what we want to do with both plants and algae. So what are the organics that we get from plants? Well, at the moment, I'm forgetting food here. I'm thinking in terms of basically resources that are used for fuel. Of course, it's starch being used for bioethanol in the United States. Now, starch comes from maize grain, and that's food. Maybe not food always for people, maybe it's food for cattle, but still people do see this as controversial because you're using grain to produce starch to make ethanol. A few years ago, there was a plan to open a factory in England to use wheat to make bioethanol. I don't know whether that factory ever went into operation, but they were planning it. Brazilian bioethanol comes from sugar in sugarcane. Of course, whether you consider sugar to be a food is a matter of opinion. A lot of people think we should eat less sugar, so maybe burning it in a car is a good way of preserving us from sweet fizzy drinks. Lipids, oil palm biodiesel. Again, very controversial. because you're cutting down rainforest in places like Indonesia to grow oil palm plantations, and that is a very difficult question, I think, for many people. In the future, however, we're not going to really use these rather more high-value products like starch, sucrose, and fats and oils, but the plan would be to use lignocellulose. Basically, the rest of the plant, the bits you really can't eat, the non-digestible bits, well, digestible if you're a cow, but not if you're a person. These are largely protein-free, so you don't really use them, you're not competing with this major plant product, which is protein, when you use lignocellulose as a feedstock for energy purposes. Now, you could burn this, but that seems rather wasteful, though I guess a lot of people will go down that option. It's probably better to use it as a source of energy-rich organic molecules, in my opinion. I think that's the best way of using this resource. So the plan in the future is not to use these relatively useful high-value products, but to use this relatively low-value product and get plants to make a lot of it, and then do things with it after the plants have made it. Ferment it into ethanol. Use it as a feedstock for bacterial fermentation to make all sorts of industrial feedstocks like acetone or butanol or whatever. Now, algae, they're still really in an experimental stage, but they have got more capacity to do interesting things because they can be grown in bioreactors in a way that's difficult for plants. You can imagine a greenhouse as a kind of bioreactor. And some people have toyed with the idea of using greenhouses in that kind of way to produce interesting exotic chemicals using plants in greenhouses. But really, I think algae seem to be the more practical approach for this. And then the question is, the possibility then is getting algae to make interesting things more or less directly. So rather than taking plant-based lignocellulose and processing it further, you would use the algae themselves to do the interesting chemistry on the basic products of photosynthesis to convert them to lipids for biodiesel and things like heavier alcohols, which could be used for combustion in cars or jet aircraft. Now, algae can be grown in ponds. That really rules out anything volatile like butanol, but it's not a problem for lipids or bioreactors. In a bioreactor, volatiles aren't a problem because you contain the system. The problem with a bioreactor is it's capital intensive. A bioreactor system is like a very good greenhouse. So it requires a lot of money to build it, and the products that come out of it have to be valuable. Otherwise, the economics don't work out, I think. So, I mean, the Dutch glasshouse industry, I think, is a very good example of the economics of this highly managed, protected cultivation system, which is essentially what a bioreactor is. So, the economic problem exists for bioreactors and algae in a way that plants don't have when you grow them in an open field system, if you grow them very extensively in particular. But the potential of algae to produce expensive and interesting products really makes them a very attractive prospect, despite the capital costs. So if I go a little bit now to the United States, they've done more work on the kind of possibilities of using plants as a source of bioenergy for fuel purposes than we have in Europe. So this is one of their analyses. Now, they were using this based on, they used a bioenergy crop called miscanthus. I'll show a picture of that shortly. It's a relative of sugarcane, but it's cold tolerant. We can grow it here. In fact, we do grow quite a lot of it in Wageningen. Now, they assumed an average annual 1% conversion efficiency of sunlight into energy and biomass. This is a conservative number. In their experiments leading up to this calculation, they were getting up to 2%. And they think that 2% is more realistic because they're still really learning how to grow this. So farmers are often growing the wrong cultivar in the wrong place and not getting very high yields. So they think that with a little bit of normal agronomic improvement, they can improve the yields to get closer to 2% conversion efficiency. Depending on the weather, of course. At the moment,
the United States has serious problems with drought. It's a big problem with bioenergy if you're dependent on weather, but that's another matter. So they figured that if they took 12 million hectares of cropland, which is about 9.5% of their agricultural land, they would get 133 billion litres of ethanol, which would meet 20% of their gasoline needs, their petrol needs, which might not seem like a lot, but of course, if you take this as part of a package of solutions, then that's quite a lot of liquid fuel, using only about 10% of their agricultural land. Now, the reason they took this 10%, 9% number was this is roughly the amount of land in the US that's not in cultivation. It's not in use. It's been set aside, based on policies or laws or mechanisms produced by Congress to basically reduce the amount of agricultural land in use. So they can basically take land that's not in use and use that to produce bioenergy crops to produce 133 billion litres of ethanol. Without, in this case, really impacting on food production by the US. Now, the number for Europe for the hectarage of cropland, I think it's a bit hard to get the numbers because a lot of the numbers in Europe are wrapped up in jargon. It's hard to know exactly what they mean by some of these words. You have to read a lot. The Americans just say, we've got this many hectares of land. In Europe, it's all agricultural equivalent units and things like that. You're thinking, what's that? So in 27 EU states, there seems to be about 172 million hectares of cropland. I think this includes grassland, and grassland would have been excluded from this number in the US. So 172 million versus about 120 million for the US. And of course, this 172 million, you can ask all sorts of questions about is this really the number for Europe? But let's come back to that in a little bit. So, what about us in Europe? Right, now this is a horrible graph when you first look at it. And what it shows is the power consumption per person, kilowatt hour per day per person, and the population density, people per square kilometre. So this is basically a measure of your energy sustainability. So if you don't have a very high density of population and you've got a very low power consumption, basically per unit land area, you don't need to harvest very much energy. Whereas if you've got a very high population density and you need a lot of energy per person, you need a very high energy generation per unit land area. So Singapore's out here somewhere, but it's not really surprising because it's just basically a city. So it's a small area with a lot of people. Bahrain, they use lots of energy, and it's quite densely populated. Now, most of Western Europe is around about here. United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, France, Switzerland, of course, not in the EU, Czech Republic, Denmark. So we're actually quite densely populated, and we need quite a lot of energy. The United States, the big sinners, they're here. They're actually quite good. Because, okay, they use a lot of energy, but the United States is big. So they can easily manage bioenergy, I think. Or it's easier for them to manage this kind of thing. Because they've got a big land area for their population. Europe as a whole, however, is here. Now, how does this happen here? The problem is, of course, they're including here in Europe, Russia. And the Ukraine isn't mentioned. And this is like, where is the other one? Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's in Europe. But I looked it up. Part of it is at least. Georgia is here somewhere, over here. It's also in Europe. So, of course, the problem when we start to do this analysis for Europe is what do you mean by Europe? If you are some certain UK political parties, you don't even think of Europe at all. Right. I mean, if you're in the Netherlands, I don't know, where do you think Europe stops? On a map, it goes all the way to the Urals. Are we thinking only in terms of the EU? So when we want to do this analysis for Europe, how do we define Europe? How do we define the land area that's available to us? How do we do all of these calculations that I showed you for the United States within Europe? That takes you into all sorts of political questions about, you know, who are we friends with at the moment? Well, lots of people we're not very friendly with. I don't think the Cypriots love us very much, so forget that. But, you know, the Russians are a bit dodgy. But, I mean, maybe we just need to be nicer to them. Maybe in 10 years it will be different. Who knows? But it is a problem when you try to do these calculations. What is the framework within which you do them, and the questions that it raises about who you trust in the world. Would you be happy relying on Russia as a place to grow your bioenergy crops? I mean, Russia's big. You could presumably grow lots of stuff there. I don't know how effective their agriculture is at the moment. From what I hear, it's not doing. They don't make very efficient use of their land. But would that be politically a good idea? I'm not sure, and certainly not for me to answer that question. The other problem in all of this is we don't know in the future what our land use requirements will be. There was an article in Reuters website a few days ago that it's expected that we've reached the peak demand very soon for agricultural land because crop productivity improvements will mean that we can feed the world with a smaller land area. Now, I didn't check all the numbers, but I guess that's a possibility. It's, you know, if population maxes out and then starts to come down and crop productivity increases, then maybe we can manage with less land for crops. A lot of people would be very doubtful about some of the arguments made in that Reuters article, but it's something we need to think about. Where do we go with all of these policies? So, in all of this, let's go back to photosynthesis again, because now to do some physiology, which is really what I spend most of my life doing. Now, first a bit of detail. Crop plants can have one of two kinds of photosynthesis. They can be either C3 or C4. This really relates to the biochemical mechanism that they use for their photosynthetic metabolism. Now, in the north temperate zone, the zone we're all familiar with, most of our crop plants and native plant species are C3. Wheat is a C3 plant. It's not particularly big. It's not particularly productive. The other type, the C4, is more typical of tropical plants, particularly tropical grasses. Now, C4 plants have got high rates of photosynthesis, but they don't do very well at low temperatures. They do very well in hot climates with lots of sunlight. And they are very productive plants. So a lot of major tropical crops are C4 plants. Sugarcane, maize, are ones you'll be familiar with, sorghum, panicum, a lot of others you probably don't know so well, millet of various types. That's C4. And our little friend here, miscanthus, which is the plant I mentioned earlier, a really popular bioenergy crop. Now, this is a miscanthus plant grown in the northern part of the United States. And this is a real person. She's not small. She is normal sized. And so this is a big plant. In the Netherlands, miscanthus will be taller than me, about here, by the end of June. So it's a very fast growing plant. This is the kind of plant that people, when they think of for bioenergy use, is what they're thinking of. This kind of highly productive plant. Not really wheat. It's not wheat has a very low energy conversion efficiency. This plant, even in England, can manage energy conversion efficiencies of 3% on good sites during the growing period. The problem is the growing period. It might be quite short in a cool temperate North European climate. So, big difference between C3 and C4 is their energy conversion efficiencies. For a C3 plant, the maximum solar energy conversion efficiency, in theory, is only about 4.5%. And that value depends strongly on temperature and carbon dioxide concentration. Most crop plants have got much lower conversion efficiencies than this. I mean, that's not in a way very often surprising because we don't grow them because they're good at converting energy into biomass. We grow them because they're good at making things we want to eat. Some grasses that we grow for cattle fodder can manage values very close to this. So you can get numbers quite close to this theoretical limit from C3 agricultural plants, but just not the ones that we're normally familiar with. What about C4? Maximum solar energy conversion efficiency up to 6%. That's getting kind of more respectable. And sustained values of 4.5% have been reported. So that's one of the reasons why bioenergy crops tend to be C4. Their conversion efficiencies are higher in general, and they achieve quite high values experimentally for quite sustained periods of time. So photosynthesis is light-driven. So how does light affect photosynthesis and crop productivity? So light is pretty well an essential factor for photosynthesis. So it's not unreasonable that light levels play a role in determining photosynthesis and crop productivity. And the relationship between light and crop productivity is really rather simple. If you take a crop and you measure the total amount of light that's been absorbed by it, and you plot the amount of dry weight that you get in that crop, it's pretty well a straight line. And the slope of this line here gives you the efficiency of conversion. And really you want this efficiency to be as big as possible. And one of the things we work on in the biosolar program is how to make this efficiency bigger. And this kind of relationship is what you find in real plants. This is a plant, a Echinocloa. It's a natural plant growing in Brazil in a floodplain. It's one of the most productive natural systems. It produces 100 tons of dry matter per year, well, in about 9 months, in fact. 100 tons per hectare. And it's a wild plant. It's probably the most productive natural system on the planet. And it follows this grass, this Echinocloa, C4, follows this straight line relationship just like it should. This is very commonly found for all crops. The more light you intercept, the more biomass there is. So more light means more crop productivity. Simple. You need light to make biomass. If you don't have as much light, you make less biomass. So let's say you're growing this same grass in Europe. You might only get this much or this much. And then your productivity is only going to be not 100 tons, but 30 tons. 30 tons would be a very respectable productivity for Northern Europe if you're growing a biomass crop. In Brazil, you get 100 tons. It's not just because you get more light and the growing season will be longer. So that puts a limit on what we can do, of course, in Europe, because this is the amount of light there is per year. Up here, you wouldn't really want to grow your biomass crops in northern Scotland. There's not much light. Well, you could grow them there, but the productivity wouldn't be very good. As you move through Europe, where they've done tests, field trials, the biomass productivity increases as you move southwards. The Netherlands isn't really that good a place because it doesn't get a lot of sunlight. I mean, we think it gets lots of sunlight. It's a nice place, but compared to here, that's not very good. Unfortunately, you need more than just light to grow crops. This is the same map for the United States. This is where they have all of their sunlight, and this is where they grow their crops. They're growing their crops here. This is soya, and this is corn, maize. And the maps for Europe are nowhere as clear as the maps for the United States. We had the same kind of problem. You know, the European maps are really hard to understand. The Americans just say, we grow corn here, and it's simple. You know, anybody can interpret this graph. The European graph needs a lot of reading. So the Americans are growing their crops really in this part of North America, not here where light intensities are high, because here there's no water. That's a problem. You need water for plant productivity. You can't avoid that. And that's a good thing about algal bioreactors. You can grow algae here because you put it in a bioreactor. The problem you have is maybe the heat load. but that's a technical question. Of course, fusion power is also a technical question, so when someone says it's just a technical question, it might be a very big technical question. But that's a big advantage of algae. We're growing crops in field conditions extensively. You don't want to worry about irrigation, you don't want to worry about all of this. You want to put them in a hole in the ground, walk away, leave them, come back a few months later, chop them down. So you grow them here where it rains, where it should rain, and everything happens naturally. You can't use these high sunlight areas here because they're too dry. They've got a lot of light because there's no cloud, basically. Here is a good place for your algal bioreactors. Now, what about the efficiency? This is where the biosolar research comes in. Can we make it better? Now, if we take a leaf and we subject it to changing light intensity and measure how much photosynthesis it does, this is the kind of responses we get. Now, the perfect system would be a straight line. As we increase light intensity, the amount of photosynthesis just goes up and up and up. It doesn't slow down. Full sunlight on this graph is this line, 2,000 micromoles meter square per second. Horrible terminology, but it's what we use. So this is the perfect plant, if we like, which doesn't really exist. The best we can get is some of these weird plants that grow in desert areas. They have to grow really fast because they grow just after it rains in the spring. And in Death Valley, where these plants come from, it doesn't say stay spring for very long. So you've got to do what you've got to do very, very fast in order that you can reproduce before it cooks. So these are very, very special plants. And they manage these phenomenal rates of photosynthesis. Now, if we take crop plants like pea does really badly. Wheat would be up here somewhere. Miscanthus is about here somewhere. They have maximum rates of photosynthesis that are really well below the optimum which some plants achieve. So we know that almost perfect photosynthesis is available. But a lot of the plants that we're working with don't achieve anything like those maximum rates of photosynthesis. And one of our goals in the biosolar program is to try and figure out how these plants do it. So normal plants that are working more or less around this area can be fixed. We can solve the problem. Oh, and by the way, this here, this little graph, this is a begonia. This is what it's doing in your living room. Yes. Don't count on this for bioenergy. This is a complete light response curve for a begonia. You got to admire it. It's cute, but it looks nice. It looks nice. The other problem is real plants are stress sensitive. They react badly to adverse environments. Now, this is our Miscanthus beauty again, and this is its response to changing temperature. When it gets cold, Miscanthus doesn't photosynthesize very well. Its photosynthesis becomes less efficient. And this is a problem for Miscanthus in spring, because it's often not very warm in spring, as anybody who walked here this morning will know. Down here somewhere. So it's a bit early for Miscanthus. Miscanthus is coming up in next month, but it'll often experience these low temperatures. In summer, not a problem. So one of the other things that we are trying to do in the biosolar program is fix this kind of stress problem. Can we create plants, by one means or another, that are more stress tolerant? So we improve the efficiency of solar energy conversion by plants and make them better sources of either food or biomass or fuel. Whatever we do some good. Whether it's for biomass or food, the end result is a good one. It's a question of which of those we get to first. The other question is the length of the growing season. This is a comparison between work done in the United States, comparing maize and Miscanthus. Now, maize is quite a short growing season. So this is the leaf area of maize and the leaf area of Miscanthus, growing in 2007 and again in 2008. And you can see the Miscanthus starts earlier and achieves a bigger leaf area, so it's trapping more light, and it lasts as a canopy. The vegetation lasts longer than maize. So Miscanthus is much more productive than maize. The efficiency of photosynthesis of the two plants is the same, more or less. If you take here this graph showing the intercepted radiation versus the amount of biomass, the slopes for miscanthus and maize are pretty well the same. But you can see that miscanthus achieves a biomass, in this case, of 30 tonnes per hectare, while maize only manages 20 tonnes per hectare. And this is largely due to the fact that maize has a short growing season. If we can make the growing season longer, then we can make more use of the available light. So another way of improving productivity is make the growing season longer, make the plant as a whole more tolerant of cooler weather early in the year and cooler weather later in the year. But all of this fixing, how do we do it? The problem with physiology is it tells you what's not working, but it doesn't often tell you how exactly you would fix it. It's a bit like when you call a plumber in and he says, "Oh, it's a problem." And then he goes away. Well, yeah, okay, I know it's a problem, but what do I do about it? You want not only to someone to tell you what's wrong, but to then say, how are we going to fix it? We're going to replace this, this, and this. Physiology is a bit like the plumber that comes and tells you what's wrong and then leaves you to sort it out. We have to move beyond that, and in the biosolar program, we are trying to bring physiology and genetics together. So we can start to fix physiological problems by understanding the genetic basis for the problem. So our plan is, and we have to really try and identify those genetic factors that are responsible for valuable physiological traits within a species or related species. Now the question is, do we move these desirable genetic factors within a species or between species using conventional breeding techniques, maybe very advanced conventional techniques, but still conventional, that is plant boy girl kind of stuff, you know, there's no hanky-panky, it's just good old honest sex, and conventional approaches, or once we've identified these genes that give us desirable physiological traits, do we then use genetic manipulation to move that gene from one organism to another? That's a debate that goes beyond what we do and really opens up to really what everyone, I think, here is probably thinking about. What do we think about genetic manipulation? Some of you will probably hate it. Others will be thinking it's a brilliant idea. Now, everybody's got an opinion, and it's always interesting to know what those opinions are and to see what you can do about it. But I should say that, well, when it comes to the genetics of photosynthesis, we're not going to be doing anything really clever tomorrow or next year or the year after that. This is difficult stuff, and we are just starting to make inroads into understanding these genetics so we can start to do, potentially, these useful things, whether it's by one means or another. So, just to summarize, we know there's a problem with food and energy supplies. Bioenergy can help us fix that problem. It's not going to be the only solution. I'm not going to say, hey, buy bioenergy and it'll solve all our problems, wrinkly skin, baldness, you name it, solved by bioenergy. I think that would be nonsense. But bioenergy can make a contribution. But it also causes us ethical problems. We've got to deal with the food fuel thing. We've got to think about, how do we use land? What's the fairest way of using land? What's the most honest way of using land? Which means asking questions. Is using land to produce fuel for car use more or less ethical than using land to produce food to feed to a cow to make steak? Which of those is more or less, or a golf course? Plants and algae can be improved, and they can help avoid this conflict by becoming more productive. But then we come to the question is, how do you improve them? What are the limits that we're allowed to go to as plant scientists to fix things, to make them work better? Because the more freedom we have, the more we can do. But maybe that freedom is not freedom that you feel we are mature enough and sensible enough to handle. And I think that's an interesting question for me to stop with. Thank you very much.
when we refer your talk to the previous talk of Huip, he was talking about some difficulties, the hurdles we have to come across in order to get to his nice image of the future. Do you have an opinion on these matters, the communication with the big companies, the patents, all this legislation?
Firstly, we're all of us now wrapped up with patents. Universities, research institutes, it's more or less expected of us to patent things. That's government policy to an extent, and if it's government policy, it's the choice of people, the electorate. So we have to live within this world of patents. Now, with regards to industry as a whole, industry is, in my experience, at least, I mean, when largely my contacts with industry are via the breeding companies, they've got a lot of smart people working for them, and you have very intelligent discussions with them. So I do not see the breeding companies as a whole as being by any means a hindrance. Mm-hmm. And given that we are encouraged to have collaborative research with companies such as breeding companies, I mean, that's a good thing from my point of view. That is to say that they are on the ball with science and technology. So we can have very constructive discussions with them. Other parts of industry are not so easy to work with. It's not that they, individually, people aren't receptive or responsive, but it's that they're very dispersed. If you think about farmers, for example, the producers of all of this, I mean, you've got a lot of small farmers, and so you can't easily have a dialogue with a lot of small farmers. In a way, in the past, they would have been represented to some extent by the Ministry of Agriculture, but now I don't think there is a Ministry of Agriculture anymore.
We can't follow this either. No, yes. We don't know.
So that becomes more difficult. So it's not that, here. It's not that the farmers. It's not that you can't talk with farmers, and by no means that's certainly not the case. But it's just that there's no easy means with which you have a dialogue with that group of people.
Yep.
So when you're talking with, so summarising, when you talk to industry and when it's organised, it's fine. And but with certain other parts of the, if you like, the production chain, then because they're not represented by big organisations, mm-hmm. then it can be more difficult.
Yeah, and the thing is about legislation. What I was complaining about, all these permits you need in order to do an experiment or build a plant or test plant.
Yeah, well, obviously for laboratory work, that's not such an issue. I think the questions surrounding GMO here are fairly substantial, because that really places limits on what we can practically conceive of doing, because there's no point in coming up with a solution which you wouldn't be allowed to implement in practice. Even though, of course, you might be able to sell it to the US or something like that, where they're less concerned about this. But yes, I think that's really something that there needs to be, yes, I suppose a debate, but there's a continued debate about genetic modification. And I suppose as a plant scientist, I have a particular opinion, a particular view. I don't see it as such a menace as other people might do. But it does seem to be difficult to persuade people that it isn't really, I think, as big a threat as they believe it to be. And most of my colleagues would be, I think, in the same boat as me with this. And I would say most scientists that I know are fairly responsible, fairly boring people. They're not really risk takers. Mm-hmm. They're not dangerous people. So they are the kind of people who, if they thought it was dangerous, probably wouldn't go anywhere near it themselves, because it's just not their nature. They are mostly fairly trustworthy. But it does seem that there has been a kind of breakdown of trust in science in the population as a whole, and I think we really have to do something to re-establish that trust, because at the moment I think quite a few of the opinions that you hear seem to me to be relatively ill-informed, or they misunderstand some of the details. Yeah, I mean, it's quite a difference if you consider medicine. If people get sick, they go straight to their doctor and they trust what the doctor says, well, 95, 99% of the time. When it comes to GMO, they don't really trust scientists in the same way that they would people trust a doctor when they get sick. And I think we have to re-establish that degree of confidence in our opinion
so that people do trust what we say.
Yeah.
Because in a way, we're the people who actually know all the details. Very often, for example, you know, the people who are giving an opinion may know less of the scientific details than we would have.
So there's need for more communication.
Well, better communication.
Better communication.
I think there's a lot of communication, but it's whether it's at the right level.
Yes, thank you very much for this very exciting presentation. I have a question about the technology that Huib de Vriend was talking about, because I think that you did not say much about that. Mostly what you said is about raising efficiency in plant systems. But what about this biomimicry systems, artificial leaves and things like that? Is that really an important part of the research program you're working on?
It is. I spoke largely for the plant part. There are three lines of research in biosolar. There's plants, algae, and sort of biomimetic type artificial solar energy conversion. The artificial technology, let's call it artificial leaf technology, synthetic leaf technology, if you prefer, is very exciting. But it's in its infancy. I mean, I hope in 10 years from now, it'll be possible for one of my colleagues to stand here and tell you wonderful things about what they've achieved. At the moment, they're working on what is a really challenging and new technology. People have been working on it on a fairly low kind of pace for quite a few years, as you saw in that earlier video. And in recent years, it's picked up in intensity. So more people working, and the more people that work on a problem, especially if those people are smart, the more likelihood there is that there's going to be the real breakthroughs that you need to make these things happen. So, I mean, it's all feasible, but it needs that sort of that expectation that you can make it happen needs to be translated into real products, and that's what they're trying to do now. So I see this as something more for the mid to longer term. What I think we have with plants is something we're able to use more or less in the short term. And you know, it will probably always be part of the recipe for solving our industrial and energy needs, because there's always going to be land to be used in that way, I think. But we got to hope that these other technologies also come online, because they will also create options with which to solve the problem that we have in supplying energy, and particularly, if you like, energy-rich organic substrates. Because though we can make electricity quite easily from photovoltaics, etc., if you want to make organic molecules, that requires a different technology, and there are lots of places lots of applications for which we need energy-rich organic molecules. You know, it's hard to put a battery in a plane and fly it across the Atlantic. Even a small battery causes problems. Ask Boeing.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here.
Jeremy, I want to ask you about your linking of conventional plant biology to heterosexual sex and unconventional sex, being GM, the sort of plumber effect. I'm just wondering if we can relate genetically modified organisms to queer politics, like how do we say gay marriage, or even new reproductive technologies. If we can talk about replacement parts, or I call it genetic xenotransplantation. Getting strange genes in from one organism to another is a kind of sex, but if it's unconventional, can we actually link it to sort of, it may be unconventional, but it's still, you know, a way of having sex?
You create sometimes the most interesting questions. I guess my response to that, I can't see a scientific link, but there is perhaps an ethical link in that we do tolerate lots of things now that we didn't tolerate in the past. 100 years ago, the kind of sex you're talking about between people would have definitely not been approved of, and now it's normal. We don't worry about our neighbours not being heterosexual, white, Christian, whatever.
we've got an open society in many, many things. It is in some ways perhaps surprising that while we've become more open in some respects, in other respects we've become more paranoid, more worried about things. And so in a sense, maybe you can see there's a bit of a mismatch between the way that we are opening up our society in some respects and closing other things down in other ways. So maybe there is a link, but the link I don't think is scientific and technical. I think it's more moral and ethical.
In your discussion, there has been we, which I guess is the human race, and then there has been the plants. There has been no discussion about other animals or any other species. Just yesterday, there was a dead bird in front of the museum, and as you know, there's a major change in the speciation of the planet.
Yes, that's a good point. I guess it's kind of outside my research and expertise area. I mean, as a normal, I grew up with David Attenborough films, and the idea that we lose rainforest really hurts me. I hope we can avoid that kind of thing. One of the points that people make about uncontrolled climate change is the damage it will do to natural species distributions. We can expect basically an extinction event as a result of abrupt climate change, because the animals and plants will not be able to keep pace with that rate of environmental change. And I think that's one of the motivations for trying to avoid a catastrophic change in climate. The need for more agricultural land, if we want to expand the area of crop production, would result in the loss of natural habitats. And that, I think, for a lot of people is something they would not wish to happen. And I can sympathise with that point of view. But then, of course, that raises the question, how do we use the land that we have? Are we already using too much land? And if we're using too much land and we want to cut back on the land that we are using, what are the sacrifices that we would make in order to have less land used for agriculture? I think it leads you into the point I made at the beginning of the talk, that when you do get into a debate about the use of land for a particular purpose, such as biofuels, it opens up a much bigger question about the way that we use land in the Netherlands, in Europe, or the world. Because, I do think there's a lot of woolly thinking around that question. Yeah. And not all of it's woolly, by the way, but some of it is.
Okay, thank you very much.